Hey guys, Matthew, and in today's video we're going to be looking at the Manifesto. Now I don't want to just go ahead and read all of this to you guys because that would be boring and I'm sure you've already all read it. What I want to talk about is basically I took some notes of the important stuff, and then I also want to talk about the implications of each of these things. It's one thing to say that flasks are changing, it's another thing to really understand what that means for you as a player. And there's a lot of these things in this Manifesto, and I'm even looking forward to the patch notes even more. But there's a lot of changes, and put it simply, it's all nerfs, right? Nothing really got buffed. Sure, there was some buffs of some underused skills, but they're still going to stay underused because the reality is that they suck. So that's pretty much how it's going. Now, I didn't make a video or anything like that when the announcement dropped because it felt like, as the way Chris was talking about how this league was going to go, it almost felt like it was doomsday for Path of Exile, realistically. Everything was going to slow down. Every build was losing upwards of 40% of their damage. Like, it just looked really, really bad. So I decided, wait, I'm just going to chill. I'm going to wait for Manifesto, and then I'm going to actually go out and go through with it. So here we are. If you're looking for my build guides, I'm waiting for patch notes because so far it seems like none of this is really affecting the builds that I was planning too much. But I still want patch notes to be completely certain. Anyways, let's get right into the actual Manifesto. Again, like I said, I'm not going to be reading through this. I'm just going to give you guys the punchlines and the what that actually means for you as a player. So let me go ahead and zoom in on this real quick. All right, so there is going to be a big buff to traps. Pretty much all of the supports, but also just traps in general, are getting buffed. Now, the thing is that a lot of the supports that work for traps, because they're getting buffed, and a lot of the supports that were used for miners are getting nerfed. It's like kind of like a indirect buff to traps and nerf to mines because of the supports that typically people use for miner builds. So what that means essentially is that if there's a possibility that this league there's going to be a lot of bossing focused around traps. So that doesn't really mean too much in terms of the economy. It does mean that certain uniques that are more so focused around traps might be more expensive, and certain uniques focused around miners might be cheaper because of the nerfs. But overall, I don't think a lot of people are going to be playing trap because, well, of the playstyle, right? A lot of people don't like the playstyle, so there's not nothing too crazy there. Because of the direct nerf to a lot of other builds, melee is getting nerfed pretty hard, like slam builds. Of course, any sort of spellcaster is getting nerfed pretty hard. Any sort of trigger spells, Spellslinger and Cast on Career, I'll talk about that in a second. Even cast 1 damage taken loops, those are all getting nerfed absolutely massively. So what that means is that because the bow skills and whatnot are not really getting nerfed at all, that it's possible that this is actually going to be a bow league, right? So the way that GGG managed to actually make a bow league is by nerfing everything else to the ground. It's kind of what it seems like, because they're not really changing anything about bow skills and about bow support gems, but they're nerfing everything else by up to 40%, which is pretty big. Okay. Massive nerf to slams. Seismic Cry is losing 30% more damage per exerted attack. That's huge. That's a lot. That's like 120% more damage that is being lost for a full, like, 4 exerted attack. You know, it's massive. This here, that's a lot of damage that the slammers are going to be losing, which makes sense because, you know, if you've seen the recent gauntlets and the recent races and all that, everybody just plays slams because you can invest into 100% defense, not worry about damage whatsoever anywhere on your build, and you're still doing millions of damage. So it's a good nerf in my opinion. It makes sense that they are nerfing this. Overall, though, for people who are, you know, playing softcore trade league, you're gonna be able to get weapons and gear that's gonna be making up for that more than enough. It's really more so looking at the people who are not investing into damage whatsoever, but still dealing a ridiculous amount of damage. Okay, next we have a pretty massive Archmage Nerf. Archmage is losing 40% of its mana scaling. So if we look at the actual Archmage support, right? Supported skills gain added lightning damage equal to 60% of its mana cost if mana cost is not higher than maximum you could spend. And this was 108. So it's actually nearly 50%, my bad, of its mana scaling. This, again, it makes sense because the reason why is Archmage was originally the build, right, around revolving around mana and stacking mana, it's actually a very good defensive build. So the problem is, well, the problem for GGG is that the build was the support gem was offering too much damage for people who are not investing into damage whatsoever. They're just investing into defense by stacking mana. So they are, I mean, 40 upwards of 50% mana scaling nerf. It's a pretty big deal. Does it mean that Archmage is completely dead? I don't think so. But it does mean that the very high end, if we're looking at builds with 10,000, 12,000 mana, they are going to be losing a pretty significant portion of their damage. But again, it's not going to be to the point where the build or the archetype of Archmage and mana stacking is completely dead. But it will put it more in line with other builds, which I think is not necessarily a bad thing, because Archmage miners especially have basically been top tier of the food chain for bossing for, I want to say, the last like 3 or 4 leagues or something. So putting them more in line with other things that are not just mana scaling is not bad. Okay, next we are getting a nerf to basically all of the awakened gems almost, or something like that is what they said. So what that means is that, well, of course they're going to be cheaper, which is pretty much an indirect nerf to farming Sirus. If you're somebody who likes to speed farm maps and then to speed farm Siruses, and you know, for the support gems or for the awakened gems especially, that is a bit of an indirect nerf. Now, how big are these nerfs? It's not too crazy. Essentially, they basically took the quality from awakened gems, and they reverted it back to their regular quality on the regular gems. And some of them, they took those awakened gem quality and they threw it instead on alternate quality gems. So it's not massive nerfs, it's not massive numerical nerfs, but it is a little bit of a nerf indeed. They said that a fully 6-linked character, right, with fully awakened gems, maximum level, quality, all that good stuff, is upwards of 50% more damage than a fully 6-linked non-awakened awakened gems. So, you know, it's a big deal, and even if they nerf that by 10 or 20%, I still think that awoke gems are going to be the way to go for the truly min-maxing. But it does mean that, you know, potentially people who like to farm Sirus are going to be making a little bit less money in general. Okay, next, Flask rework. Now, this is what I was the most apprehensive about. This is what I was the most scared about, and for a good reason, I guess. It seems to be that I tend to predict things quite right when it comes to balance changes in this game, because, man, they killed it. They really destroyed Flasks, like, badly. Diamond Flasks is now complete trash, okay? We went from your critical strike chance is lucky, which is basically double the crit, right? It rolls twice, decides whether you crit or not, to 100% increased critical strikes, which is about, it's actually less of a critical strike chance than you could roll on a one-handed weapon, right? So for example, on a one-handed weapon, I think you can get 150% critical strike chance to spells or something like that. Well, the Diamond Flask is now 100% increased. It is garbage. It's really bad, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It does mean that builds that didn't have to invest into a significant amount of crit are now going to have to invest into a significant amount of crit, and they are also removing crit from Bottled Faith, which is why I said Bottled Faith dead. I don't even know if it's going to be worthwhile this coming league to farm the Cortex and therefore to farm the Feared. That's how big of a nerf they're doing to Bottled Faith, and one of the biggest jackpot loot from farming the Feared is Bottled Faith. So Bottled Faith is losing the base crit, right? The thing that goes up to 2% of crit to enemies that are on consecrated ground. Well, this is going away. This is an astronomical nerf to Bottled Faith, to the point where the Flask is, quite frankly, pretty useless, right? It's no better than something like an Inquis Promise without the base crit. And the same thing for the Diamond Flask. It's like, why would you ever even use this? It's pretty bad. Dying Sun, I think they talked about it, but it's not too big of a nerf. It's keeping the projectiles. It's keeping the AoE. It's actually not too big of a nerf. It's basically just going to require more charges and consume more charges. So you're not going to have as good uptime. That being said, they did say now that you can scale the amount of projectile and AoE with Flask Effect and all that to the point where you can get something like 4 additional projectiles. That's pretty cool. But that's if you use the Enkindling Orb or whatever it's called, which makes it so you don't get any flash charges during the effect of your Flask, which is like, well, unless you're 100% front loaded your damage, right? And you're trying to do as much damage in a short amount of time as possible. AKA, if you're a miner, this enkindling orb thing is pretty cool. Otherwise, it's useless, right? Nobody wants to have increased flask effect if it means that they can't gain flash charges during the effect, because that means that they basically have at most a 50% uptime on their flask, which is like pretty bad. So yeah, whatever, I guess. Okay, Enduring Mana Flask is getting nerfed. They did say that it was basically helping too much with mana sustain, so they are nerfing it. Now, we don't have the numbers on this, I believe, but it does mean that if you've been using an Enduring Mana Flask like me for the past years and years, you are now actually going to have to be a little bit more careful with your mana consumption and also your mana flask management. You're not just going to be able to just slam on it and you know, be good to go. That's a bit annoying because I personally hate managing my mana. I love the idea of an Enduring Flask because of that. It allows me to just not have to think about mana issues. But we don't have the numbers on how bad this nerf is going to be. Okay, next we have an Armor and Evasion reduced by 40% from the Flask. So this is, we're talking about the modifiers on, for example, an Evasion Flask that says like you have like 100% evasion during Flask effect, right? 100% increased evasion. Now this is being cut by 40%. So it's going to be maximum, a perfect roll is going to be 60%. So capping Queen of the Forest is probably going to be pretty hard for lab owners, getting that 45,000 evasion. So that's a little bit unfortunate. Otherwise, it's not too big of a deal. It's more so, I guess, for hardcore that this is a bigger nerf. Overall, it's not too big of a deal. But they're also nerfing the actual base of the flask, right? So the flask, instead of being 100% increased evasion, is like something like 60% on the different flask, and 60% armor on granite or whatever it is. Or was it granite? Or is it 20% more armor or something? So yeah, they're nerfing flasks like really hard, to the point where of course they're still going to be worth using. I mean, there's no reason not to use flasks, but I do think that utility flasks and damage flasks are going to be a lot less popular, or a lot less important, a lot less of a priority on your build because of all these really massive nerfs, especially because they're also nerfing the amount of charges that you get, both in the campaign but even more so in maps, they said. So again, we don't have the numbers on that. We need to get an actual feel for it. I'm pretty sure that once you're in the end game and you're just zooming through maps, you're going to have permanent uptime on your flask. It's not going to matter. But in the early stages of a league where you're not zooming through maps and killing everything in one shot, that's where I feel like flask management is going to be a bit more of an issue. Okay, next, Raider is losing 50% ailment immunity. So you used to be completely ailment immune while phasing, I believe. Now it's only 50%. Which means that if you want to be completely ailment immune, you're going to need to get that elsewhere. It could be crafts, Ailsing unveils. I'll talk about that in a second. It could be, you know, different things, but you need to get the other 50% elsewhere. Otherwise, there's basically no point to get that ascendancy node unless you want it for the other stuff that it comes with. Inquisitor and Elementalist is losing 100% of its ailment immunity. So Inquisitor used to be ailment immune on consecrated ground, I believe, and Elementalist with golems or something, I can't quite remember. Now, none. No ailment immunity for these classes. So again, this is a massive hit, especially for hardcore. I feel like in standard or in softcore, ailments was never too big of a deal, right? You only care about getting frozen because that's annoying. But overall, it's never been too crazy. It's more so for survivability in hardcore. Next, Poison. Poison is getting a 50% buff all around the board, right? 50% more damage everywhere. That's a big nerf, or sorry, that's a big buff. Pretty much the only buff for this entire thing. But to make up for this 50% buff, 50% more damage everywhere, right? They are nerfing the actual poison ascendancy, which is, of course, assassin, right? Not just nerfing it a little bit. They are nerfing it like heavily. But you are getting that 50% more. So I did the math on this, and you're losing something like 10% damage if you're playing an assassin for poison. So overall, the 50% nerf, it's about a 50% buff versus about a 60% nerf. So it's overall a bit of a loss of damage, especially because of Coralitos' signature is now absolute garbage. The only thing this flask does now, Coralitos, I'm not sure if there's a picture of it. Yeah, the only thing you get from this is 30% damage multiplier from poison. For poison with critical strikes. That's it. That's the only thing you get, which is like absolutely awful. And they also buff the amount of chaos damage per second that you take. So it's overall, this is a horrible flask now. And yeah, which kind of messes with the assassin ascendancy when it comes to poison. Pathfinder. Now, it's written a bit weird, the way that it's written for the Pathfinder, but it's actually a nerf. People thought it was a buff, right? But it's a nerf. You're losing 33% chance. It goes from 30 to 20%, but to deal 100% more damage. So it's actually about a 10% less damage, 10% damage nerf. But remember, 50% more damage. So overall, Pathfinder is actually kind of getting a buff when it comes to poison versions and all the other ascendancies as well. Because of the 50%, except for assassin. They really want to try to make it so people don't just play assassin if they think of making a poison build, which is not, you know, a bad thing, build diversity and all that, but having the feeling that you actually have a choice of which ascendancy you want to play, because otherwise all the other ones are significantly worse. But overall, yeah, it's a pretty big nerf to the assassin ascendancy. Okay, next, Spellslinger, cast on crit, basically dead. Spellslinger, you are basically slinging 4 or 5 skills typically, right? And you are reserving like 95% of your mana or something. Well, that's just done for, because now your spell slinging and your cast on crit and your cast on damage taken are all going to actually cost mana. If you don't have mana, you can't cast the spells. So that means that you're either going to have to give up an aura, give up some support gems in order to be able to have the required mana, or, you know, fit some 1% mana reservation corruption jewels on your build. Either you're going to have to basically invest a lot more currency to be able to get back to what it used to be, or, I mean, if you don't have the budget to be able to do that and you don't want to just drop some support gems, to be honest, Spellslinger and Cast on Crit are just not looking good. But these builds have been extremely popular for a long time now, and some of at the top of the food chain, really, especially Cast on Crit being some of the best build every single league. So the GGG finally decided that they wanted a new meta. Again, this league is all about, you know, swapping the meta around and basically turning the game on top of its head. So it's not a bad thing. Okay, next we have a smoke mine buff. Sorry, that's not a buff, it's a nerf. So essentially the smoke mine buff, which gives you the additional movement speed for whatever how many seconds, has been changed to 1 second, and it decays. Basically what that means is smoke mine doesn't really make you any faster now. Very big nerf to people who like speed leveling with smoke mine. And also a bit of a mapping nerf, but not too big of a deal for mapping. It's mostly for people who like to speed level with a smoke mine. Okay, next we have a big dash nerf. Honestly, you basically won't be able to spam dash anymore. It's getting a, I think, 0.5 second extra on the cooldown, which is not that big of a deal, but it's actually going to be losing cooldown recovery speed. So which means you're by a lot. I think it's like 40% less cooldown recovery speed or something. So you're not going to be able to spam either dash or flame dash anywhere near as much as before, especially as it levels up, right? Because the thing is, as you leveled the gem up, as you were progressing through the story and then through maps, as the gem got higher level, you would be able to use it more and more and more. They nerfed that by a lot to where it's I think it's like 40% less. So yeah, to the people who are really like big spammers of the movement abilities, kind of a big deal. Not to mention, there's also a massive nerf to Second Wind. Now, Second Wind, the way that it used to work is that it would give you +1, you know, charge. So that still does that. So your flame dash, for example, would have 3 charges instead of 2. But the big, massive nerf is that now, instead of increasing your cooldown recovery speed, making it so you can spam your skills even more, it's actually reducing your cooldown recovery speed so you can spam it even less. So yes, you do get an additional charge, but at the cost of less charges, or sorry, less spamming of the movement skill overall. So it's actually a pretty annoying nerf, especially not necessarily so much for flame dash or dash or smoke mine. This nerf is especially annoying for your actual block skill, or not block skills, but what are they called? Things like Arcane Cloak or things like Steel Skin, right? Those guys that protect you from dying, Val Molten Shell, even stuff like that. Now you're no longer going to want to be putting Second Wind on them, because it's actually going to reduce the amount of time, increase the amount of time before you can use your skill again, which is like drastically bad for these, because of course the more uptime, the more survivability you have on your build. So that's also a bit of a nerf to survivability on the on the builds. Okay, so yeah, cast wound damage taken setups, be it Immortal Call, be it Steel Skin, you know, Arcane Cloak on your left click, all of those are basically getting nerfed pretty heavily. Okay, next we are getting, okay, I already mentioned that, a mana nerf to Arcane Surge. It's not huge, but you are also losing the cast speed buff from Arcane Surge. It's not a massive buff, but it's just like a little slap on the wrist to Arcane Surge, because almost every single build uses it, especially on something like your movement ability, right? Smoke Mine with Arcane Surge is super, or not Smoke Mine, like Flame Dash is super popular, right? For spellcasters, it gives you that spell damage, that cast speed, that mana regen. Well, all of that is getting nerfed to some extent, but they did say that it's not too important. Okay, Fortify effect is getting a massive nerf. It's basically going to be capped at around 40% less damage taken, instead of around 80 to 90% like it currently is right now. Like right now, if you stack a ton of Fortify effect, you can get around 80 to 90% less damage taken, especially from physical, if I remember correctly. It's dropping to tops if you invest into Fortify effect around 40%, which means, again, this is a massive nerf to survivability, especially targeted towards hardcore players. For softcore, it's kind of like whatever, but it is a big nerf to survivability. Like, that's actually a massive nerf to survivability for builds that actually utilize Fortify. Okay, next there is a massive nerf to dot builds. Clusters no longer provide multi from the small notables, only increase. So if you think about your fire damage over time multiplier clusters, right, that everybody was using with Burning Arrow this league, instead of having fire damage over time multiplier, it's just going to have fire damage, increased fire damage, right? So they are removing a lot of multiplier for builds that tend to stack a lot of these clusters. Overall, though, this only applies to your small notables, and typically on a medium cluster, you only have a few of those. So it's not like a massive deal, but it is definitely something that you will notice if you're somebody who, you know, has many of these clusters on their builds. Okay, probably one of the most controversial and the most annoying nerf in the entirety of the manifesto, at least for me as a crafter especially. Ashling is now completely useless if you're not giga rich. So the way that Ashling used to work is that you would put an item in the thing, right? And you would unveil it, and whatever you get is whatever you get. Now, Ashling is going to remove a modifier before adding a new one. So what that means is that, let's just say you have a modifier on a bow, like +2 arrows, which is incredibly rare, and you want to Ashling the bow in order to get like a 5th modifier, right? Well, there's a chance that it just removes your +2 arrow. That's a really big deal for crafting. Like, that's a massive nerf. But if you are incredibly rich, my guess is that this is going to respect meta mods. So if we take this exact example that I said, and you have a bow with +2 arrows on a suffix, if you craft on suffixes cannot be changed, which is a prefix, and then you Ashling, right, it can only remove a prefix. And if there's, let's just say, a good prefix, like, I don't know, +1 to all socketed gems, and then an open prefix for your Ashling, and then of course you'd also have the other modifier, which is your suffixes cannot be changed, then it's actually a 50-50 what it's going to hit between your suffixes, or sorry, between your prefixes cannot be, or sorry, suffixes cannot be changed modifier, and of course the actual +1 to all socketed gems. So what that means is, once again, they're adding currency to crafting. They're adding an extra step, and that extra step is 2 exalt every single try. So of course you are never really guaranteed to hit those. So this is of course not necessarily something that's going to affect the majority of players, because most people never even really use Ashling for their own items when crafting, because it was worth so much, like some like 3 or 4 exalts or whatever. Now it's just even worse, because crafters are going to be a lot more careful with actually buying and utilizing Ashling, because this is a pretty severe nerf. And of course the regular folks are just not even going to use this, period, because of course who would want to gamble an extra mod on their item in order to get something that might not even be good? Because when you Ashling, it's not guaranteed that you get what you want, right? A lot of the time you have a 20-30% chance or so it's, I don't really see the point. It's not looking good. Okay, no longer any permanent focus. Now this again is mostly for hardcore. Focus would give you some pretty ridiculous defensive and offensive capabilities. So no longer being able to perma focus, because focus is not going to go down while it's active, the cooldown, right? So you're only going to have at most 50% uptime if you're perfect on your actual focus. All right, next, golems no longer provide damage per golem, so that's a massive nerf to Golementalists. People who like to play stacking golem builds, right, get a bunch of golems, well, they are no longer getting damage per golem. So yeah, pretty big nerf. But most of the time, if you're playing a Golementalist, your golems are the ones doing the damage, not you. So it's not like that big of a deal. But for builds that were basically stacking a bunch of golems to buff your own character, well, yeah, no longer, not even 10%, not nothing. They just cut it out completely. So that's a pretty big nerf to Elementalists, on top of the fact that they're losing element immunity. I think Elementalist is not going to be anywhere near as popular anymore. Raider is losing 50% onslaught effect, which again, that's also a pretty big nerf, especially considering they're also losing ailment immunity, and they're also losing the move speed on the small passives for I can't remember, I think it's the charges or something, the frenzy charges. So that's also just slow. GGG just basically trying to slow down the game. Okay, next, Abyss jewels are no longer going to be able to roll onslaught on kill. So most builds that I've ever made, if I wanted to get onslaught and I didn't want to use a silver flask, I would just get an Abyss jewel and put onslaught on kill with something like corrupted blood, right? 2 birds and 1 stone, and I would be happy with that. Well, no longer possible. If you want onslaught, you're gonna have to get it on the tree, get it on your boots. I think onslaught on your boots, especially the unveil from Ailsing, right? Onslaught on kill is going to be extremely popular this league, even more so than last league, because it's going to be one of the only reliable way to get onslaught, unless of course you're using a silver flask. All right, high defense shield crafting may be good. So this is in regards to the spectral shield throw. It's getting a massive buff. It's actually huge buff to spectral shield throw. So because of this, it's possible that high defense shield crafting is going to be good. So pay attention to that. If it's very popular, what you want to do is use the shields which have the highest defense on base, and just spam dense fossils on those in order to get as high defense as possible. You can get upwards of nearly 3,000 defense on a shield, and those are actually worth a lot already. Now they're going to be worth even more. Okay, now they did say that they were nerfing Fire Burst. They didn't give us numbers. My guess is that it's completely dead. Of course, we'll have to wait and see. I could be wrong. Maybe it's not going to be too big of a nerf, but I'm expecting some pretty massive nerf to Fire Burst because of, again, especially hardcore play. People were investing literally zero into damage and just completely annihilating maps because Fire Burst scaling was pretty insane. Hollow Palm is losing 20% attack speed. It's not like a decrease, it's a less attack speed, so it's actually a pretty big deal, but it should still be fine, especially on the high end. But on the low end, Hollow Palm is going to be definitely something that's going to be a lot less strong with minimal investment. And then finally, Blade Blast is losing AoE, which means less clear speed, and also, of course, less overlap, which means less single target damage, and it's losing Unnerved, which this by itself is 10% less damage, right? Because Unnerved makes it so the bosses take 10% increased damage, which is essentially saying 10% more damage for your build. Well, this is 10% less damage instantly. So if you've been wondering, should I play Bladefall Blade Blast? Well, you're losing at least 10% damage and some AoE overlap. Is it still going to be good? Of course, we need to wait for patch notes. Okay, so that's pretty much the punchlines and what I think it, actually means for the game. Now, if I was to give a bit of a conclusion on my thoughts on these whole changes, I think that a lot of it is okay. I think that a meta shakeup is great, actually, because especially as a content creator, it gives us basically free reign on what we want to do in terms of content. And instead of making the exact same videos every single time that we typically make every single league, now we have to rediscover the game the same way that casual has to, right? We have to relearn what's the best. We have to rework our builds, our actual builds, to figure out, this used to be the best build for bossing on an extremely small budget, but now it just doesn't have anywhere near the damage anymore. So we have to basically rework the entire game, and I think that's good. What I don't like personally is the flash changes. I think the flash changes are really, really a bit extreme. But again, I get it. They want the game to be harder. They want the game to be slower. and it definitely does seem, I feel like I'm basically repeating myself exactly what I said from the Manifesto last league, in the patch notes last league, when I was saying, you know, they want to slow down the game. They want to slow down the game for PoE 2, and it's clear as day what they're trying to do. Now, whether this is something that is going to affect, you know, the game long term in a good or a bad way is not something that I'm able to predict. I do think that a lot of the Zoomers, the people who like to go fast and just blast maps, player retention numbers for those people, that group of people, is probably going to be fairly low. But because of all the new builds and all that, I think that the more casual player, right, is going to have a lot more to experience with the league this time around, a lot more builds to try out. And I think a lot of items that people were used to being very expensive, things like Bottled Faith, for example, are going to be drastically decreasing in price. I think there's going to be a meta shakeup in terms of the economy as well. With all these nerfs, you know, Flask that used to be 1C might now be 1X, and Flask that used to be 1X might now be 1C. Because we don't know the exact numbers on everything yet. Same thing for like I was talking about at the very beginning of the video, right? Miner stuff versus trapper stuff. You know, it's possible that miners are getting completely gutted and the traps are going to be the way to go. We just don't know. For that, we'll need the actual patch notes. Anyways, that's pretty much it for the video. I've been talking for long enough. Before I go, as always, I want to say a massive thank you to my supporters: Jordan, Fruitfly, Thomas, Neroth, Master, Tim, Nate, Jacob, Flame Scorpion, Reese, Emma, Road to Millions, Alex, Brandon, Don, Joseph, welcome back, Panda, Atticus, Scott, Bard, Grimoire, Johnny, Ronald, Kevin, Mercury, and Bizen. So as of course, anybody else who has supported me in the past and anybody else who wishes to remain anonymous. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.